So I see some of the students from the class are here and super,
good.
yeah, super excited for today and all the workshops that you've put together. So that's enough. Thank you.
Well, thanks for bringing students.
Thank you. Yeah. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we are streaming live for the first time ever on Facebook. So thank you all for being here for that. We'll see if that's working. I think Francis will let us know if it's working, but I just want to start by thanking you all for joining us. I hope everyone can hear me well. If not, you can go ahead and type in the chat. My name is Lisa Logan. I'm the manager of the Women's and Gender Education Center here at Eastern Washington University. And I just want to start us off with a land recognition. This is something I'm learning more about all the time, and we need to be sure that we're doing what we can to disrupt colonialism in our lives. So this is a work in progress, but I do want to begin with the recognition that the space I'm sitting in today is built on the traditional homelands of the Spokane people. And the Coeur d'Alene people's traditional homelands are also near here. Many regional tribes share a history in this area, and I encourage each of us to consider the impacts of colonialism in our lives and on our campuses and our cities. And to consider our intentions and our efforts to disrupt and dismantle the systems behind those impacts. And with that, we will go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Kissling and Dr. Fahs. Thank you. And I'll be in the chat if anyone needs me.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I appreciate that very much. Can
I say one more thing? I'm so sorry to interrupt. I did forget to let participants know that the most useful view for you to put your screen in will be speaker view, because we are in a meeting. That way, Dr. Kissling and Dr. Fahs will pop up when they're speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, Lisa has been tremendous in helping me figure out the technical details of setting this up. I don't think I could do it without them. Because there's a difference between meeting and webinar capacity in Zoom, and what we have is meeting, not webinar. So that means that it's not going to come across with just Breanne and me. You'll see everybody unless you select that speaker view. Of course, you're certainly welcome to do whatever view you want, but if you want to focus on Breanne and me, select speaker view. And also, you can use the chat box. Another drawback of the meeting view versus webinar view is that to put in questions, use the chat forum. We don't have the Q&A box that you may have seen in when fancy people do webinars. So we're using the chat box. And I think if you're on Facebook, you have a different option. And what do they do on Facebook, Lisa? Francis, what do they do on Facebook?
Sorry, what's the question?
What do the people do on Facebook Live if they want to ask a question?
Oh, they can ask a question. They can just like comment on the FB Live video as we're doing it, and then I'll be forwarding the questions to you.
Great. So everybody knows what to do when they have questions. Well, then let's get started. And I want to follow the example of one of my favorite podcast hosts and ask my guests to introduce themselves. So I'm going to let Breanne introduce herself and start us off. So can you please introduce yourself, Breanne?
Sure, no problem. So my name is Breanne Fahs. I'm a professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University. And I've kind of had a dual life, both as a psychology person and as a women's studies person since the beginning. So I also, in addition to my role of teaching and research, I work as a private practice clinical psychologist as well, and mostly working with people on issues of sexuality and embodiment, which is really fun to kind of ground, even work on menstruation. You hear a lot about that in therapy as well. And most of my research focuses on women's sexuality, especially kind of the way that people make narratives about their own sexuality. And then I sort of call it critical embodiment, but really what it's kind of turned into for me anyway, is really looking at abject bodies, or bodies that are sort of marked as othered or disgusting or gross, and that's everything from, looking at women's body hair to menstruation to fatness, along a big bunch of things like that. I'm also really interested in political activism and the history of radical feminism. And so I've written a biography of Valerie Solanas, and I'm constantly trying to interview older activists about their work and sort of thinking about reimagining things like sex and love and intergenerational kind of learning and all sorts of things that way too. So that's kind of the bucket of things that I work in. And menstruation is one of my favorites, especially working with people like Liz. So I'm so grateful for being invited to do this and excited to be here.
Thank you. I didn't realize there was that connection between your clinical work and your research. I knew you had clinical practice, but I was surprised to hear you say that menstruation comes up in clinical practice.
Oh my gosh, it comes up all the time. Even right now, it comes up all the time. Women are having weird periods. They talk about it all the time. I think they experience their right before they menstruate, they experience like their emotional distress in more intense ways right now. I think COVID periods are like under examine. I'm excited about thinking about that too.
Oh, that's going to be your next book, isn't it?
COVID periods. Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask how you started studying menstruation. And is that how you got into it, from your clinical practice, or was there something else?
No, actually this is like a weird kind of maybe slightly dorky academic story, but there was a call for papers in a journal that I can't even remember what it was on, and the special issue was on blood. And I felt like that was such a provocative topic that I hadn't really thought about, but I had just collected a bunch of data on women's sexuality. And I had asked a few questions about women's experiences of menstrual sex. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to write this up and submit this to this special issue. And of course, they didn't like it. It was like a humanities journal. It was like a super social science-y piece. And they were kind of like, we don't know what to do with all this data. We don't like this piece. So it got rejected. But then I had presented this piece at a conference at AWP, and Joan had come up to me and said, we have this whole, society that thinks about menstrual studies, and you should join and like think about this thing. So that I kind of got seduced into it. And then after that, especially after going to SMCR conference, I felt like this was like such a fun thing to have a group of scholars thinking about feminism and the body all the time. You don't have to make any, you don't have to explain anything to them or like, try to convince them to care about the body. And I think as a psychologist, it's often hard to get people to think about bodies, but SMCR is just such a lovely group of people who are always doing that. So then I was hooked, and now I think in some ways, I think I do research on menstruation because it fits into different intersections that I care about, but also because I just really, really like the community of thinking around it and about it, which I think our book that just came out really represents, right? It's like, this is kind of an emblem of that community and what it means to kind of think together. And one of my favorite things to do is really to kind of imagine how we think together and how we kind of, not just sort of working in a silo by yourself, but like thinking collectively is really fun. And I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, we sure had a dream team for that book. But just to fill in for our audience, Joan is Joan Chrysler, who just recently retired from Connecticut College, who I think technically she's not really a founder, but I think of her as one of the godmothers of the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, SMCR, which is a pretty fun conference. It is a place where, one of the few places we don't have to explain ourselves. Yeah, the last few conferences have had menstrual poetry readings, poetry slams that are menstruation themed, which have been really fun, and just all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah,
and I mean, menstruation is such a fun topic in the sense that it's like so provocative. It shouldn't be, of course, right? It's mundane. It's sort of an everyday practice of the body that happens, but it's very provocative. So I think for my particular intersections, I'm really interested in how menstruation can like align with these funny sort of moments of activism or political provocation. I mean, it's one of those subjects that truly enrages right-wingers, which also makes me delighted. So I love that about it. There's so many things I love about studying menstruation, but I do think it has really important like political potential. And I think it's, it's certainly not just a private experience of the body. So I also appreciate that at the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, we have a lot of space to kind of frame menstruation that way as well, not just as individual experiences, but looking really across patterns and also at, how it can be politically provocative too. So let's have you introduce yourself a little bit, and I want to hear how you came to this.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, and you don't have to talk about it, but you have had some experience with inflamed right-wingers around your work.
They're always lurking, aren't they? I mean,
yeah.
They're always lurking. But they like to get mad about things that I'm surprised they get mad about. And really it's like the body stuff that they're mad about. Like I said, I wrote a biography about Valerie Solanas, who, for those of you who don't know her, she wrote this incredibly inflammatory manifesto called Scum Manifesto that was like, murder and death. It was really provocative. And like other things that I've written about, even sexuality, have never gotten the kind of like backlash that body hair and fatness and menstruation get. So I do think there is something about the accessibility of thinking about bodies that also is an interesting inroads into like why it's provocative and how. But yeah, they get really mad at me about writing about blood and body hair and fatness. So yeah.
Yeah, I got a call one time because one of my talks on campus was advertised in the community, and some guy calls me up and wants me to. It says, "Will you?" And I just got voicemail. I didn't have to talk to him, and he says something like, "Will you come and give a talk at Jack and Dan's Tavern about female masturbation?" And I'm so glad I didn't have to talk to him, because my first thought was, well, let's ask your wife. I'm sure she knows about it.
Well, you're like, menstruation and masturbation are actually two different things, but
Yeah,
I've actually had that exact same thing happen where some like people who are getting very mad about students doing work around menstruation thought it was about masturbation. Like they merged the words. So I don't know, maybe this is a bigger problem than we think. I don't know.
yeah.
But let's hear about you, Liz, because you're a rock star. We want to know about you.
Yeah. Well, I don't talk about this very much, this part of it, but since we have an audience, we're broadcasting live. I first wrote about menstruation when I was in high school, because the menstrual TSS crisis happened when I was a senior in high school. And so I wrote about that for my term paper for senior rhetoric. Decided I wanted to explore that, and I don't remember my analysis very well. Oh, sorry, I see in the chat, TSS was toxic shock syndrome. And this happened in 1980, in the summer and fall of 1980. I'd like you all to meet my friend Ruby. Sorry, there's someone working on our heater, our furnace system, and she's not happy someone's in the house. But there was an outbreak of toxic shock syndrome, which is a bacterial infection of the blood, and it was linked to tampons, ultra absorbent tampons, and probably caused by the ultra absorbency and particular fibers in the tampons. And it was, I want to say it was about 38 women actually died from this, and it wasn't taken as seriously as it should have. The tampon companies had to be really compelled by activists to pull them from the market. And it's the reason that we now have standards in absorbency, because at that time, one brand's regular would be equivalent to another brand's super, and there was no standardization. The FDA had to compel brands to do that, and it took years and a court order to make the brands do it, because of this crisis that started in 1980. So I actually wrote about this in high school, but I didn't really get into it as a research topic seriously until grad school. I wanted to do my dissertation. I was in communication, and I wanted to look at bodies and language, because I was so interested in how the body, seemingly the thing that we know most intimately, but can't really express outside of language. And I wanted some topic that would let me look at how the body is communicated with language and communication. And I was especially interested in women and gender issues. So I wanted something that was unique to women. And this was before I was very aware of trans issues. So I wasn't thinking in terms of menstruators, but I was looking for something that was common to women, but that would become, and unique to women. So I didn't want to write about childbirth. And I ended up hitting on menstruation, because it was at the same time in my grad career, I was also taking classes in folklore studies, and I took a class on narrative and story. And I was reading Emily Martin's Woman in the Body. I had another class through kinesiology about body, culture, and society. That was a cultural studies oriented class. And they all kind of coalesced for me. And I started thinking about how the first period is a moment that everyone who menstruates always remembers. It's something that that people typically don't forget their first period. And in fact, they have a story about it. You retell this in the form of a narrative. And I started calling them first blood stories, and had the idea of looking at how people reconstruct their first period as a story, and where they learn about that, and what kind of information. And I ended up doing this kind of intertextual study where I interviewed adolescent girls about their first period, and I interviewed their mothers and their junior high health teacher. And I looked at, from asking the girls, I asked where else they got information. So I also looked at the teen magazines that they told me they read. And the junior high health teacher gave me a copy of the book that she used in class. So I tried to look at all the sources of information that they got, that they used to get information about periods. And of course, doing a study like that today, I'd have to look at social media and I don't know, TikTok and Snapchat and all those things. So it'd be a lot harder to do now. But back then, it was the early 90s. So I was looking at YM magazine. I think Sassy might have, I don't remember if Sassy was still in print. Sassy was probably on the way out then. So I started in grad school looking for a way I could study communication about the body, and how embodiment is also linguistic.
I mean, that's sort of funny when you think about how maybe all of who we are is somehow already there. There's like a blueprint when we're like super young. I mean, when I was in college, I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on women's orgasms, and I've never stopped being interested in that topic. But so when I went back and looked at it, maybe like a couple years ago, I was shocked how, like, I was already obsessed with all these things about the body. I was already thinking about Valerie Solanas. I was already thinking about the fake orgasm as this quintessential kind of moment of like the failure of the women's liberation movement. What does this mean that we like it's really funny. I love that. So you've been like a menstrual scholar forever. That's kind of a cool story.
Well, and I tried to get away from it. I wrote this article I published it in 98, I think, about the way that Uta Pippig's period, when she bled visibly during the Boston Marathon. I wrote a paper about how that was covered in the media, in the sports pages, because there were some sports pages that were, oh, she had female issues, and some that were just, her period started during the race, and some that just didn't acknowledge it at all. And that was supposed to be my transition out of writing about menstruation. I was supposed to be getting away from it. And, and somehow I just kept getting pulled back in, because it was after that came out that Joan Chrysler invited me to keynote at SMCR. And then, I got pulled back into writing about it. And I wrote Capitalizing on the Curse after that, and, and started moving away. And, it was just 2 years ago, I wrote a book about abortion. And then damn Chris Bobel asked me to work on the Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies. And that's why, people are here today. They wanted to hear more about critical menstruation studies rather than necessarily our stories. But that's where you've been all along, is the critical menstruation studies. Why is this way? And focusing on menstruation, as you've already said, as menstruation is something that can tie all of these other topics together.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to think about. And this book, I think, it's weird even now, like, we worked on it for all these years, but now that it's a book and you can go back through the different chapters, it's really incredible to see some of the territory laid in this book that just there was no real work on that before, like, or old essays that have been brought back to life in this book, or, so and just as a reminder, I mean, I'm sure you know this by now, but in case any of you don't, this book, we got a grant to allow it to be open access. So it's completely free to download the entire 1,000-page book, or you can go through and select individual chapters, or if you're teaching, you can grab some chapters off of there. And that includes all of these like reprints as well, or like things that were previously published in older forms and stuff like that. So I'm really proud of that too, that we can like sort of disseminate the book differently than most books. I mean, most academic books end up being prohibitively expensive and difficult for people to access. And so this feels like it's certainly my first foray in really seeing what the potential is for an open access book in terms of just like, all of you can just go grab it right now, which is really quite exciting. So hopefully Liz or Lisa or one of you can throw the link in case any of you haven't done so. But yeah, it was really quite fun to try to think, expansively about like what is the field of critical menstruation studies. So Liz, tell me more about your thoughts about just if you were defining what that means, like what is critical menstruation studies?
Yeah, I was hoping we would be able to talk a little bit about the categories, and because when we were putting this together, I think, Chris came to, by the time she approached me, she already had an outline with these categories. And menstruation is, for those of you who haven't looked at the book yet, the idea of menstruation is fundamental, menstruation is embodied, menstruation is a rationale, menstruation is structural, menstruation is material, and menstruation is narrative. And I don't know if you were involved in developing those, Breanne, or if she and Shara Vostrel came up with all those.
Yeah, mostly the two of them came up with these as frameworks, and then we kind of helped to fill in some of the details or imagination. But it was important because it was a non-disciplinary focused emphasis, and it was a non-geographical focused emphasis. So some texts will like throw everything from the global south like into its own sort of quarantined area of the book, and we didn't want to do that. And it really, it was meant to really bring together very like wide ranging and I think pretty unique kind of nodes of thinking, right? So and each one, and we'll kind of talk about each one a little bit, but each one of these themes is sort of designed around trying to think about bodies of work that maybe wouldn't normally be put into conversation. And I really like including across time spaces, right? So we have essays that are kind of reprinted from the 1970s, and most of them of course are very contemporary, but it was nice to see those conversations that really wouldn't normally happen in the kind of organization of a book.
Yeah, I really love the organization that way, because like you say, we didn't do it geographically. We didn't do it by life cycle, although the entire lifespan of menstruation is represented. So many collections are organized by menarche, menstruation, and menopause, and we have all of that represented, but again, it's throughout those 6 sections. And because there's so many of the individual topics could have gone into more than one section. Like the Maureen McHugh's piece about menstrual moaning. When we first talked about that, we were thinking about putting it in the narrative section, and it ended up in menstruation as rationale. And I think there are a couple of others that could have easily been in more than one section. Like how many different pieces could have been in menstruation as embodied, which ended up, I think actually might be the shortest section. I haven't counted out, but just in looking through again and trying to pick out, well, what do we want to talk about today? So I think let me check. I can't see the time. So we're already about it's already about 1:30, but just to kind of quickly talk about some of these sections and talking about menstruation as fundamental, this is the idea about menstruation just being a fundamental part of what it means to be human, that it combines the personal and the public, the private and personal and political, private and public, the physiological and the social. And you can't separate those. You can't talk about menstruation as being just a physiological function, because it's all just like my attempt to find a research subject that would let me look at communication about the body. We're never just a body, because the body is always already embedded in cultural discourse. And when we look at menstruation, it doesn't have it's not just physiology. It always already has a cultural meaning. So in that section, Inga Winkler put together that section, and her expertise is in human rights. So she talks about how menstruation can either facilitate or impede a range of human rights. Some of the chapters in that section there's a lot of personal narratives in that section. One deal is from Muso Bakoto Sawo, where she talks about getting her period at the age of 12, but concealing it from her family. She's grew up in Gambia and concealed it for 2 years so that she wouldn't have to get married because she wanted to finish school. So she tried to conceal her period for her entire, for as long as she could. But a cousin saw it and told everybody. So she had to get married, which is a very different experience than most of us have in the US. We don't have to think in terms of, get my first period, then now I got to get married, got to quit school and get married. It's
I love in that
fundamental to
section
human
too
right.
how they move across spaces that we're just starting, I think, in the field of critical menstruation studies to really understand how important it is to try to find voices that are often excluded from the discourses of menstruation. So there's a lot of this section has some really cool chapters on things like what does it mean to menstruate while in jail? What does it mean to menstruate while homeless?
Mhm.
Just like these kind of interesting different, or like what does it mean to menstruate? There's a chapter on menstruating in the slums of New Delhi, right? So like thinking about these intersections of race, poverty, institutionalization, and of course in these moments of an institutionalization we especially see the exertions of power over menstruators, right? And like what does it mean for like back to the women in jail sort of framework of getting like the products that you need without that being like this financial burden, or without that being a form of manipulation, right? Where people will hold that over people in prisons to sort of deny them care and things like that. So it's for those of you who maybe are used to thinking about menstruation more like only in kind of your own framework and your own body, which is really often how we do think about something like this, because it's not something that's talked about nearly enough. The book does offer, I think, some windows into completely different frameworks for thinking about menstruation. Again, back to that theme of menstruation as fundamental.
Yeah, and that just, you can see those connections again with how they, when you make menstruation the center, and that's really the heart of what we mean by critical menstrual studies, is instead of studying it as a health issue or as a social issue, or, it's menstruation is the subject of study. It's, menstruation is the lens through which we look at human rights or religion. There's several pieces about menstruation through the lens of through religion and how its meaning and how it's treated in different religions. There's several pieces about menstruation in Hindu religion, or Ilana Cohen's piece looking at how some of the similarities between Hinduism and Judaism, both regarding menstruation as an impurity. And what happens there. And that's, I think, that's in the Menstruation is Fundamental section, because religion is so fundamental in so many places. And what happens, when you cannot practice your religion because you're not pure, you soil the temple.
Right.
Yeah.
And then should we talk
go
about
ahead.
the next section, or did you want to talk more
Go
about
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so the next section, this one, like I said, it was almost true that most of the pieces maybe could have fit into this. So this is menstruation as embodied. But really, we were really trying to kind of hone in on what does it mean to like think about the kind of material qualities of being inside a menstruating body, right? Or thinking about the needs of the actual body. So I think this section is one of the most exciting. I mean, I love them all, but this one, you move through things like stigma, or like the monstrous femininity, or thinking about sort of vaginal health, menopause, endometriosis. I mean, really this section has something for everyone. But I don't know, I really like kind of the idea of what it means to kind of locate, and it sounds ironic, of course, because of course it seems like we automatically locate menstruation in the body, but sometimes we forget to think about, what does it mean that managing menstruation, for example, means that we're mostly concealing it, right? Or mostly avoiding leakage or avoiding the public display of it. So there's some interesting pieces, like Jill Wood's piece in that one is thinking about like the concealment imperative, right? That part of being in a menstruating body is ironically to not have a body that's menstruating publicly. And that kind of tension is like woven
as a
throughout.
non-menstruator.
Yeah. So what are your favorites in this section?
I like Heather Dillaway's piece about the uncertainty of menopause, that there's just, everybody wants to know when they're going to stop, and they think they've stopped because they've gone 4 months without a period. Is it over? And then surprise. And she says, it's just uncertainty. You just have to live with uncertainty. And that is your life status now. And it's really kind of, radical and revolutionary to just say, this is your life now, not knowing what's going to happen next. Get used to it. And I just love that uncertainty, and it's really, when you think about it, it's kind of like the rest of the menstrual life cycle, right? Because you might have a pretty regular cycle, but really, you don't know. You don't know. You could be surprised anytime. And you don't know when your first period's going to start. All your friends might have started, but you haven't yet. Or you might be the first one and you think all your friends have. Maybe they haven't. You don't know. It's always uncertain. So
yeah, it brings up that sort of intimacy of who do we talk to about these things, right? And with menopause, there's even less of a kind of cultural conversation, which makes all these informal networks of being embodied all the more important. I love in this section too the pieces on really critically thinking about PMS, not to like invalidate the experience of PMS, but to imagine like what does it mean that sometimes our emotional distress gets funneled into the space of PMS. And I think there's going to be a lot, like I said, on COVID with that. I hear about this constantly from people where it's like, their whatever we want to call their PMS experiences are really like their rage and uncertainty and feelings of distress and like maybe even feeling uncomfortable in their body. That's like, it's like a sort of buffet of options of what happens during that period of time. But I really do like thinking about like the kind of cultural narratives of PMS where, again, not making it just about the individual's distress, but thinking about it as like this cultural level phenomenon where it becomes more socially acceptable for people to even acknowledge their distress or their anger, or their feelings of being out of control, or just like the kind of more unpleasant material qualities of the body in that period. So anyway, there's something for everyone in this section too, I think.
Yeah, well, that's Paula Kaplan and Joan Chrysler have been saying that for years, that, PMS is just, it's the one socially, culturally sanctioned way women can express rage. And what did Joan say? That, maybe she doesn't need an antidepressant. Maybe she just needs a nap or a divorce.
Yeah. I know. And I recently started working a little bit on menstrual synchrony and kind of looking at the stories that people tell about that. And I feel like that's maybe another layer of that where, we don't have a lot of great scientific evidence that's super consistent that menstrual synchrony or people's periods syncing up. That actually turns out not to be super real. But what is real is that women often feel solidarity around anger, right? Or like, menstruators kind of band together in that time to feel like they can, express culturally accepted distress. And I think there's a real draw to that. Like if we think about why would people largely continue to overwhelmingly believe in something that's not necessarily scientifically validated anymore at all, really. The methods on these stuff is a mess, but really I think it's that people really want that kind of solidarity. There's not a lot of periods where we get to be, have solidarity around anger that's located in the body. So there's another kind of iteration of that too.
Yeah, because anger is dismissed about women's anger is dismissed about so many things. So
right.
Yeah, solidarity.
Yeah. And then we kind of move to menstruation as rationale. And this is the section that I edited in the book. And this one's kind of fun. I really feel like it has a kind of strange, again, this strange bedfellow kind of metaphor, I guess, works really well for this because it moves from thinking about this early piece of Gloria Steinem's, which many of you may know, called If Men Could Menstruate. She means this very satirically, but it's been reprinted and reprinted and reprinted, and people go back to it so much, and it's so powerful, right? Just the simple inversion, which a lot of writers in the 70s in particular were doing, where they're basically taking the prevailing logic of the day and just saying, let's reverse this and see how absurd it sounds, right? in some ways also why I'm very interested in Valerie Solanas. She did that too. She was like, no, there's no penis envy. You know, men have pussy envy. She just flipped it over, you know, among many other things. But I thought that was it's clever, right? So for those of you who have never read If Men Could Menstruate, it's a short piece. It's really effective as a teaching piece as well. And like the power of just inverting the logic, right? So anyway, so the section sort of starts with that and then moves through a variety of different ones. But I think one of the highlights is sort of thinking about the menstrual monster. So this like unhinged sort of figure, and menstrual moaning, which is like the kind of incessant complaining that we often sort of deny people when they're bleeding from doing, right? And like, what does it mean to like experience like pain and to complain, right? And so we're trying to kind of make space in this section too for the notion of kind of like the unpleasantness of menstruation, and how that very unpleasantness is used as a rationale to block, you know, access to rights, or to you know, commonly we hear this during presidential campaigns even now, that like, you know, we can't have menstruation aged women, you know, in positions of leadership because they're too unhinged because of their menstrual cycle. So this section is kind of trying to take on this notion of menstruation as rationale. There's a piece also on the way that men and boys learn about menstruation, even though they're often framed as being totally outside of that, you know, separated out in the menstrual curriculums, for example, where only, you know, 5th grade girls get this curriculum, but they don't teach boys anything. So kind of thinking about, again, these moments where we sort of, you know, partition out gender in this way as a kind of rationale for, in some ways, shaming and adding stigma to the menstrual cycle. So Liz, you want to jump in with anything about this section that stands out to you?
I didn't have much in my notes because I figured you would have a lot to say about it. Yeah, so much about menstruation as this rationale that defines women and limits women. So yeah.
I mean, there's, you know, and we also have, there's a piece about menstruation in Malawi. So the ways in which, again, like the stories that start to develop very early for girls are often about exclusion and about like separation. And I think, you know, these kinds of things I think are really hard to kind of really fathom how deep of an impact they have on the thinking about menstruation too. I think we forgot to mention too that every single section has this thing called a transnational dialogue. And this was something where we wanted to come up with something where we like actively and consciously put into conversation people from around the world really thinking about like different themes. So the transnational dialogue in this particular section is on menstrual education, which is also another one where we see like these themes of exclusion, or who should learn about something, who should know, how we teach. You know, often we bump up against those kind of rhetorics of, you know, the stereotypes of, you know, like girls as only needing to know about managing menstruation via products versus what is the menstrual cycle for, or what are the different aspects of the menstrual cycle. So we really want that, you know, that piece to be like a provocation for people to think about when we teach about menstruation. What are we really teaching as a kind of underlying kind of premise of it, right? Are we teaching people, for example, that the whole menstrual cycle matters, or just the bleeding period, right? Or are we thinking about the kind of, you know, problematics of the corporate intrusions on teaching menstruation? So, and that there's no real easy answer to this, right? But for those of you who don't know this, the main way that girls are taught right now in schools about menstruation is a curriculum designed and sponsored and even sometimes delivered by representatives from Procter and Gamble, right? So they basically have this really short introduction to menstruation followed by, here's a pad, please use this for life, which of course we know, you know, people do become very loyal purchasers of a certain brand if they're introduced to them very early. But when you have this kind of, you know, corporate model for thinking about menstrual education, that can be really problematic. Same with, you know, people in the US designing a curriculum for women in Africa. Like there's some really odd problems with that in terms of understanding people's menstrual needs, or you know, thinking about like cross-cultural sort of differences and approaches to that. One of the key ones that Chris Bobel always likes to talk about is that we like to constantly imagine that the biggest need that people have, like for example, for girls throughout Africa, is that they need, disposable single-use products, when you ask them, what do you need help with or information about, what girls tell you is that we need help managing pain, right? So we're like solving a problem that's really not necessarily the problem that people are saying that they're having. And I really like, so the transnational dialogue is also trying to kind of think about that as well. Like, how do we think about menstrual education without just imposing this idea of what we think are the big problems, which is manage stigma, make sure menstruation becomes invisible, when that's not the problem that people are bringing to light, right? So I think, that's another one that, of course, I'm always kind of interested to think about too. But
yeah, and that one comes up over and over, is that, all these American and British companies that come in and, and all these companies that want to raise money for pads for girls and bring them the pads, and that's not necessarily what they want. And they're not missing school because they don't have pads. They're missing school because they're in pain. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what are our blind spots? We have blind spots in the US too around pain. We really don't deal with pain. We don't really teach people how to manage it well. We don't talk about it nearly enough. People don't know what endometriosis pain is, and that it's actually a bit different than average pain. We just don't think about pain nearly enough. So that's something that we can learn, I think, from,
we have as many girls missing school in the US from menstrual pain as we do in other nations that we think we can go be, the white saviors for. So it's distressing when you start looking closely at some of that data.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Oh, I don't want to spend too much more because I know we've got some questions piling up, but I want to address, we have 3 more sections. Menstruation as structural is a section that looks at how menstruation is shaped or shapes institutions and laws, policies, budgets, guidelines, taxation, data collection. And this section includes chapters that deal with period poverty issues, menstrual equity, menstrual leave. And the theme that kind of goes through these chapters is that for policy to affect or normalize menstruation, the initiatives have to challenge norms and stigma to make a real difference. There's one chapter by Archana Patkar, who talks about the shift from the 90s to the mid 2000s in attitudes following the policies. Once policy started approving menstrual health, or once nations started approving menstrual health policies, then people could start talking about it more. Once it's in the policies, and so, but when people don't talk about it, when you start having policies around, health and hygiene, do you have equal bathrooms? Menstruation doesn't come up. You have to talk about it to get it in the policies, and then people talk about it. I think it's in that section that Jennifer Weiss-Wolf's article about a menstrual equity agenda that has to affect everything, that it's not just taxation. That might be in the menstruation as material section.
I think it's one. Yeah, I think it's in the next one. But the menstrual leave article in this section, I think, is especially provocative because it's one of those subjects that we're just now starting to grapple with, and that different countries are dealing with very, very differently. So you have some countries that are just very openly, much more open dialogue about, should this be a kind of workplace accommodation? Is this a thing where we need to have these structural things in place for people to have, to even just document, I'm taking menstrual leave for the next 3 days. And what would be the advantage of that? And then people saying, well, if you have a menstrual leave, then it sort of frames menstruation as, in maybe a sort of illness or pathology sort of model, right? So it's a really provocative debate, I think. And also, what would it mean? I guess we're all kind of in this mode, or maybe not all of us, but a lot of us are in this mode now of having to think about, what does it mean to out one's health status to your employer, right? At least in my situation at Arizona State, we had to formally apply to teach on Zoom because everything is officially in person. So in order to teach on Zoom this semester, you had to get an official waiver to do so. And in order to get that waiver, you had to submit a huge pile of your health information to not just the university officials, but also to your dean and your own boss, right? Your director, right? And that was like an incredible, weird violation. It felt to me so awful to feel like, you know, our immediate supervisor was able to like look through people's like childcare statuses and stuff like this. So it did give me a little bit of a different perspective, I think, on thinking about menstrual leave. Like, what would it be like to have this as an official documented thing in terms of like the outing of menstruation, or even outing of gender status, right? Just lots of things are implied that I don't think we've quite gotten to the bottom of. But when we pretend that people don't need this, there may also be a hazard, right? In terms of, especially with people with, you know, extreme, you know, period pain or cramps and that sort of stuff. So this is another one of those lovely intersections in this, this whole section really is trying to think about how do we imagine like when menstruation butts up against, you know, structural institutional frameworks that don't always really accommodate menstruating bodies and what they need, right? So yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, that is such a provocative issue because it runs into not just the accommodation and then the bias and stigma against menstruation, because if you need so much menstrual leave, maybe you shouldn't be working, and the stereotypes about women that are, you know, the menstruation is rationale again. You know, if you need that much leave, maybe you're not well enough to work, stuff that you run into with disclosing your health status. Yeah, that's so, yeah, so funny. You had to request permission to teach on Zoom. At Eastern, you had to request permission to teach face to face, and
that's
and
because things make more sense in Washington than they do in Arizona.
Sometimes, yeah, but
we got it all wrong down there. I don't know. You guys are in an enviable state, maybe. I don't know.
We had to prove that the course had to be taught in person and provide documentation and rationales.
Please let that be my life. It's just great. Our university was like, go ahead and die. We don't really care. They actually explicitly were talking about how they had calculated the percentage of students and faculty that could get sick by opening in person, and that they were okay with a certain amount of death, right? So we were kind of like, huh, what does that mean? It's pretty, this is a weird period of time. This is why we can't think rationally about anything now, because it's all just like with the aura of death and murder. It's crazy. We're just in existential crisis all the time right now. So yeah, to the extent that we can think about anything else, it's actually kind of a refreshing break. But yeah. So so this moves us on to menstruation as material. And this one, we're really trying to think about the material conditions of menstruation. So things like toxic shock syndrome, which we just mentioned, thinking about like different kinds of like hormone issues. How do we track periods in terms of like, many of you may be using period tracking devices and sort of thinking about the technological implications of that. And they're hilarious, right? Those can be so bizarre with so much investment of certain kinds of values. Like at least the one I still use it, although I absolutely hate it. Every time I'm supposedly ovulating, there's like trees exploding with butterflies and like fireworks and celebration. And then when you're bleeding, it's just like there's nothing. It's just like, you know, the thing is sort of designed to be, I suppose, a kind of, you know, in service of fertility planning maybe or something. But the way that
one of those closet doors from The Shining with all the blood.
It's so crazy. I mean, the way that fertility is celebrated as this like wonderful thing. And then, you know, when most people, of course, are like if they are using it for fertility, they're often using it like for anti-fertility, right? Like, how do I not get pregnant? But the framework is always sort of tilted towards ovulation with exploding butterflies. And then they have like this thing where you can go and look at the kinds of different symptoms that you're having and track your symptoms. And like 99% of them are negative, right? So there's almost nothing for like menstrual joy, or I feel relaxed, or I feel anything good, just anything else. It's all just it's distress. It's various kinds of distress. That's it. So, you know, again, thinking about these kind of like material conditions of this.
Or the very material of menstruation, that there's so little research on what actually menstrual fluid is.
Yeah. There's a chapter in there on painting with blood. So we've been thinking about it as a text, a sort of substance for making art. There's a chapter on autistic experiences of menstruation, which is another really understudied area. We were very proud to have that chapter as well. And
I stand Nancy Ream. I enjoy her. You know, she wrote, Nancy Ream has been menstrual studies researcher and an activist for a very long time. She was involved, she was just starting out in her career during the crisis with the tampons and toxic shock. And she was involved in the research about tampon absorbency and the development of the syngina, the synthetic vagina that was used to test tampon absorbency. And one of the things that she learned in those days, and it astonished her, is they tested tampon and pad absorbency with blue saline. They just used saline and dyed it blue, to test, because, nobody wanted to actually look at blood or red. And she suggested that they could get, expired blood from blood banks in hospitals to use to test. And all, everybody else on the research team didn't want to do that. Why would we do that? Ew, that's disgusting. And they didn't want to do it. And partly because it was disgusting, it was unaesthetic, but also, they didn't want to clog up the syngina with actual blood. They wanted to keep using saline. But, yeah, so that section is really fascinating too. There's so much there.
Yeah. Tell us about your section before we move to the Q&A.
Yeah, we just have a little bit of time left.
Let's hear about your section.
Well, the section that I did is menstruation as narrative, which goes back to my beginning looking at menstruation and storytelling, because stories are, they're how we make sense of the world, how we think, we communicate in stories. There's some communication researchers that say, human beings are storytellers by nature. That's how we make sense. So, that's how we talk about menstruation and think about menstruation. And there's some really great pieces here. If you were on our call last week with our official launch, you got to hear Berkeley Connor talk about Periods for Pence, which was a campaign that sprouted from some activists in Indiana when Mike Pence was governor there, and was passing some restrictive laws about abortion that basically prevented abortion, almost before you're pregnant. So people started calling the governor's office, and reporting the status of their periods. And they started doing this on Twitter and calling and organizing this. And Berkeley's analysis was about how people began collectively using their posts about their periods, and this becomes a collective rhetoric, a collective way of building a narrative, drawing on some communication theory and talking about how individual periods, as different as they all are, became a kind of collective form of storytelling.
I feel like we should just start doing that, Liz. Like every time we're pissed off about something about gender in any institution, we should just adopt a periods for Pence mode. And just shoot your college president a quick email about the specific nature of your clots. I mean, it's if you did this en masse, I feel like I love that model. I just want to interrupt and say that is one of my absolute favorite chapters, and it is so hilarious. For those of you who are just feeling really depressed about the Coney Barrett handmaid situation or any of this, reading about Periods for Pence is a delight. It truly is. Because it's such a fun, cheeky way of people fighting back, and it's beautiful. I just think it's wonderful. It's such a good form of activism. I think we should do so much more.
It is, and it's so smart because it's clearly in response to a law that was drafted with no knowledge of how conception works. It's well, I want to let the governor know that my period started. I wonder if he wants to check my tampon. Should I send it to him? Or, I'm having some cramps today. Is the governor concerned? Because now he's practicing gynecology. It's awesome.
Yeah.
We also have a chapter that the interviews with women in Nepal, which is really interesting because they've outlawed the practice of chapauti. I don't think I'm pronouncing that quite correctly, which where menstruating women are no longer legally allowed to be secluded in cowsheds and huts, but it's still sometimes practiced. And it's very dangerous because the temperatures can get very cold. There's a lot of snakes. Women have died from snake bite, but there's a lot of menstrual taboos that are still common, still practiced. And while menstrual education is very poor, some of the women interviewed talked about how they didn't get advanced information about what periods were, but at the same time, family members would tease them. So they clearly knew, and they would say things like, yeah, you're going to get a big surprise when you turn about 13, but wouldn't tell them. So you just, one day you start bleeding and you think you're dying, which seems, that seems so much crueler than, just not telling people. Just, there's lots of people like in my mother's generation and older that might not have known what a period was, but nobody would have teased them about it because you just didn't talk about it.
Right.
So there's a couple of pieces like that from our transnational contributors. There's a piece about menopause in one of the states in India about how it has mixed meanings. Well, it's not necessarily negative, or there's a mixture of there's some ambivalence because there's so much freedom in life after menopause, because you're no longer restricted from the temple. You can go whenever you want. Your kids are grown. You have fewer household responsibilities. So that's a cool piece. And the transnational piece that I got to collaborate on with Milena was really kind of fun to write, because there were women from several different places, menstruators from several different places. And there was, it was what you were saying earlier about how when it comes to menopause, there's even less conversation. So many people in different places talking about not knowing what to expect with menopause and not having places to go to find out. That there's, with the first period, lots of people can go to friends and talk about it and compare notes and and have stories about a friend talking them through how to use their first tampon. But when it's time for menopause, it's a big secret. And we've found that in so many places. And I enjoyed working on that with Milena, because, I found it in my family. One of my aunts is, my youngest aunt is only 10 years older than me, has 4 older sisters, and she says not a one of them would tell her anything. They all said, oh, it's no big deal, nothing happens. I don't remember. And she's like, no one will tell me. No one will tell me. So to find out, it's, this nearly the same thing seems to be happening all over the world. It was fun to write about. I think we have time for some questions. Oh my goodness, it's 2:00.
Yep, we have about 15 minutes. So I went ahead and started my video so you can see that I'm here. But we have had a few questions from Facebook. So Ryan Perry Munger asks, please ignore this if it isn't on track. Sorry, I'm late. You have talked about this have you talked about this? In critical disability studies, there's a lot of talk about leaky bodies and how their excess, lack of control is both a sign and justification of their unfitness for humanness, citizenship, personhood. And from queer studies too, this topic comes up quite a bit. So. Any reflection on that?
Well, their unfitness is in some ways, or accusations of unfitness is what makes it so provocative too, right? Instead of, and I think, critical menstruation studies is trying to think about, instead of like moving away from that or saying, no, we're not really leaky. No, we're not really unfit. Instead, like absolutely like just double downing on that, right? Like, yes, there's leaks, and yes, there's bleeding, and yes, there's actual material blood. And instead of trying to hide that, we're going to think about what does it mean to put that in more of a public space or public sphere, and really thinking about even like, and not just in like a metaphoric sense, but like an actual, like really grappling with what does it mean that you have bodies in some ways with menstruation that are kind of erupting into the public sphere in all sorts of ways, right? Whether it's in those like institutional frameworks we just talked about, or leaking through your clothes, or bringing up menstruation in, contexts in which it's not often discussed. So I think in the book, we're really trying to think about, absolutely doing no work around enhancing respectability of menstruation, and instead kind of really like, leaning heavily into those like potential, I guess, negative stereotypes or accusations. And I know critical disability studies is doing a lot of work where they're doing that too, right? And for me, every single movement and every single subfield that's interested in respectability more than its political activist potential, I think kind of disappoints me. Whereas the ones that lean into their political potential and their activist potential and their disruptive potential are the most exciting kind of emerging fields, at least for me. I don't know, Liz, if you would agree, but like I love that about, you know, fat studies, critical disability studies, you know, at like freak studies is a thing, right? That's sort of coming into, there's just so many cool fields that are just like absolutely not working in an assimilative models. They're just like intentionally, purposefully anti-assimilative, you know, maybe riffing off of like the old, you know, the kind of old school like queer studies model that, you know, now we just come to take for granted. But like queer studies was really one of the first to be like just refuse, like just absolutely refusing an assimilative model and just being like, no, queerness is about marginality. We want the marginality. We're like heavily investing in the marginality. And you know, that the kind of that process I think is really important for fields like critical menstruation studies to be in reference to. At least that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, well, and I would say we've seen that more explicitly on the activist side, where you have like the free bleeders who don't use any products at all, or some of Chella Quint's work, like her stains campaign, that she made up this mock campaign, and she had these felt stains that you could pin onto your clothes, you know, to celebrate menstruation. Somewhere I've got a picture of me with one of those big red felt stains. It's about this big, pinned to the butt of my black skirt from one of the SMCR conferences. And she had designed basically this whole ad campaign about stains as fashion. And you know, there were these big felt ones that you could pin on your clothes. And there's pictures from a conference, you know, with a bunch of us wearing them. And I had one on my butt. And she even made jewelry. I don't know if I still have
the tampon earrings and stuff.
Yeah, but she had the stains. See, there were earrings in the shape of a stain and a ring in the shape of a stain.
That's right.
You know, the kind of to make fun of the idea that we're so worried about staining. You know, and I know she has a poem too about a stain, and you know, and I think you can find her website at Period Positive, and see some of her work about it. But so we're seeing, yeah, so celebrate the abject. Yeah. Now I want to point out though, and I don't know the real name of this person because this was on a Tumblr site, but there was a young woman of color pointing out that it's pretty young white women who get away with stuff like that more than women of color whose bodies are already seen as abject in our culture. That a Black woman with stains is perceived differently than a pretty young white woman. Especially,
yeah, I mean, that's kind of, it's an important conversation too, like for bodies that are already marked more as other, even for like fat bodies too, right? Is there more at stake for like leaning into abjection or not? And that's, I think that's like a fun theoretical question, but also one with lots of practical implications. Like, how do we sort of design menstrual activism with that in mind, in terms of like who has the most to lose, or what, you know, how do people have different costs to the work that they do and stuff? So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we don't want to just be unconscious about the fact that, you know, it's not the same menstrual party for everybody, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Didn't you have an assignment for one of your classes, or maybe it was an extra credit thing where they could experiment with wearing a real stain in public?
It wasn't quite that, but I do an assignment in one of my classes that's about menstrual activism, and they have complete freedom. They work in groups. They have complete freedom to do whatever they want. And one of the groups designed this thing where, and the only idea is that you make an intervention. You're not doing assessment, right? So you're not doing a poll or a survey and that sort of thing. You're doing something that is meant to like challenge stigma, or doing something, you know, active. So this one group decided to have this woman, you know, very like sort of conventional thin. I think she actually even worked as a model, with white pants, like with a very visible menstrual stain, like walk through the mall, and they filmed people's responses to her. And sort of, you know, when people would come up to her, they would like hand her like an information sheet of what they were doing. But it was amazing, like the panic that this induced in people in a space like a public mall, right? Where like older women were coming up, sort of ushering her to this side, and like the person filming was being very subtle in the back, so the footage was pretty funny. But this group really documented people's like, in the ways like there's a group of teenage boys that would like sort of, publicly humiliate her and just start saying like a mean thing towards her. And lots of women would just like whisper like, hey, you have like a huge stain, but the way that we manage this idea of like the leaky body is it's so vividly captured in that example. But I mean, that's the thing that goes on all the time, where we really imagine like disaster for people if they reveal their menstrual status, or especially if they show blood. The blood cannot be seen.
Let's see if we can deal with some more questions.
Yeah, we have 2 more left in about 6 minutes, so you can decide. And let's see. The first one is, if you could change how the school system talks about menstruation, what would you change? Would you enforce in every workplace? Oh, would you enforce the requirement that every workplace would have menstruation leave? Also, anybody else annoyed that the word men is in things involving women, like menstruation?
Well, in terms of schools, I want like an anti-corporate curriculum, right? I mean, thinking about, for example, like, most people in their 20s have never, and you all are probably not in this group, but most people in their 20s have never heard of the menstrual cup or reusable menstrual pads or any other option other than single-use disposable products, right? I mean, that's like something that I think we kind of owe to this kind of corporate intrusion too. Like, it would be nice to kind of have a different framing of menstruation, of a, like, really hitting that, like the menstrual cycle is a kind of marker of health, or, kind of thinking more expansively about menstrual education seems like a really important thing. I don't know, Liz, what would you say about menstrual leave? That one I don't know, I feel like I'm just now really starting to grapple with the implications. So I don't have a clear sense of that for myself, of what I want to happen yet, but I really, really enjoy reading about the tensions. But maybe, Liz, you have like
No, I don't have a good answer either on menstrual leave, because I think it's so complicated. Because I don't want people to have to work when they're in pain, but I also see such double binds. I do want better menstrual education. I would like the corporations out of the schools. I would like people, whether they menstruate or not, to have medically accurate, age-appropriate education about their bodies. I teach a course on health. It's called Gender, Health, and Marginalization. It used to be called Women's Health Issues. And I teach about menstruation and sex education in this class. And I teach another course about sexuality, and I sometimes do a little bit in there. But one of the things I like to ask, just to kind of gauge students' knowledge, is I say, where in the body does menstruation start? And almost never does anyone actually know. Sometimes they say the uterus, sometimes they say the ovaries. And I always have to, if anyone can see Lisa pointing to their head, menstruation starts in the hypothalamus. It doesn't start in your ovaries. It's not just a reproductive function, it's actually an endocrine function. And nobody knows that, because all you ever learn about menstruation, if you've learned about it at all, is that it just happens in your uterus. It's fine to get a hysterectomy and an oophorectomy, because, especially if you're done having children, because you don't need it, and it's not, nobody ever learns it as part of a whole system, that it has endocrine functions beyond just reproduction. I don't know how many, I can just see names for most of you. I don't know how many of you might be young and female assigned at birth, if you know that regular ovulation is very closely tied to bone health. And if you are taking hormonal birth control, like using the pill or the patch or the implant, and if you use it long term, and especially if you use it without breaks, you want to make sure you're up on your calcium supplements and getting good exercise, because you might be risking long-term bone health. You might have bones like a lady in her 50s like me, even though you're only 23, if you've been using hormonal contraceptives, because you need to ovulate regularly. And people don't learn that. I don't know how many times, when we talk about the pill, and menstruation in class. You know, people say, oh, I take the pill to regulate my period. No, you don't. That's not how the pill works. That's not
Yeah.
how the pill doesn't regulate your period.
There's so many gaps, aren't there? Like what you just said about like the endocrine function, you know, that's something that like if women are or people are bleeding excessively, right? And we're talking like, you know, if you're bleeding through a tampon in 30 minutes or something, like sometimes what people forget to look for is an endocrine malfunction. And so though people keep thinking, oh, you know, it's fibroids, it's something in your uterus. And even like our medical stigma and stuff around this focuses on problems in the structure of the uterus instead of looking at it as an endocrine issue, right? So you have, you know, people going in saying, hey, I've got these issues. Or like even the other day, this is maybe kind of a funny little anecdote, but I was thinking we have no way to look online. Like I was looking everywhere for like, where is there a visual that shows people when menstrual clots are big enough to worry about and when they're normal? You can find pictures of every surgery on planet Earth that has ever happened and every gross thing that's ever gone on, but you cannot find just a clear visual of like, here's like a, you know, like a hand, and here's the size of a clot that is a problem, and here's the size of a clot that is not a problem. That is not a piece of medical.
Bigger than a strawberry?
I mean, this is crazy that it's not out there, you know, where you can't just easily look up, is this a crazy medieval, like strange, problematic clot, or is this just like a normal kind of thing, right? That's something that we should have access to immediately in what's available out there online, and it's not, right? So to think we're even close to where we need to be with menstrual education, including in the public sphere, is just, we're not. We need so much more in all those little ways, but part of it is we need to learn what people need, right? And I think, you know, if you have needs, send them to SMCR, because that is an organization designed to sort of keep on thinking about building, you know, like inclusivity, but also just like, where are the gaps in knowledge that we need to keep filling and kind of keep looking at. And this book is a sort of effort to do that, but it's certainly not like the definitive final word in any of that.
Yeah, and it's certainly not. I mean, as much as I love this book, I want people to read it. I'm, you know, like you, I'm so happy that it's open access, you know, but it's not something I would hand, you know, my 12-year-old niece or something, right? It's not going to answer her questions. And, you know, and a 12-year-old handed this book that weighs 3 pounds, you know, this is not going to be, oh, great, thanks.
Right.
I want to be really respectful of your time and everyone's time. So I'll make sure for those questions that didn't get answered and all the comments, I'll be sure that the panelists receive all of those comments and questions. Thanks to all the audience and all. It's 2:16, so I'll let you two wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I was worried we wouldn't have enough. We wouldn't talk enough to fill the time. Excuse me. I want to thank you so much, Breanne, for joining me. And I want to say thank you to Lisa for all their help managing registration and Zoom and the flyers and posters and so much more. And thank Judy Rohrer, who is the Director of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies at EWU, for additional support and sponsoring the program. And thank our other sponsors, the Women's and Gender Education Center and the College of Social Sciences at Eastern. And thanks to Dean Vernon Logue for approving the program.
And thanks to you, Liz,
for hanging out with me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.